13 years before the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock, Spanish settlers built a capital deep in the high desert of the Southwest, a city born of conquest, faith, rebellion, and survival. This is the forgotten story of Santa Fe, the oldest capital in North America. Long before maps were drawn, long before flags were planted or churches rose from red earth, there was the Tewa world. High in the northern Rio Grande Valley, beneath the vast blue skies of what is now New Mexico, a complex, sacred society thrived. The mountains that would one day be called the Sangre de Cristo were not landmarks to be conquered. They were living ancestors. The rivers were not obstacles, they were lifelines. And Santa Fe? It was not a beginning, it was an interruption. By the 12th century, the ancestors of the Tewa Pueblo people had already built a world shaped by ritual, architecture, and ecological knowledge. Their homes were made of adobe and stone, clustered into multi-story villages called pueblos. These were not nomads or scattered bands. They were urban planners, farmers, engineers, and philosophers. Centuries before European boots ever set foot in the Southwest. Corn, beans, and squash, the sacred triad, grew in carefully tended fields. Irrigation channels snaked through the desert, carrying snowmelt from distant mountains. These communities were sustained not just by soil and water, but by ceremony. Life was a cycle, not a conquest. The Tewa, along with other Puebloan peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Tewa, understood time as circular. Seasons were honored through kivas, underground ceremonial chambers that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. The people danced in masks that represented rain, ancestors, and cosmic beings. Every action was tied to balance, to reciprocity with the earth. There were no kings, no armies. Leadership rotated, guided by religious duty, not personal ambition. Decision-making was communal. Harmony was the highest virtue. This was a world of ritual order, not rigid hierarchy. By the 1300s, the region we now call northern New Mexico had become a mosaic of pueblo settlements, each autonomous, yet connected through trade, marriage, and shared cosmology. The site that would one day be Santa Fe was nestled in a basin where trails converged, a strategic and sacred place. Nearby were the villages of Tesuque, Pojoaque, and Nambe. Tewa communities that traced their origins not to a founding date, but to emergence from the earth itself. According to Tewa belief, people came into this world through the Sipapu, a spiritual portal symbolized in every kiva. The land was not to be owned. It was to be honored. And then came the whispers from the south. In 1540, the first Europeans arrived. A Spanish conquistador named Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition into the southwest, lured by legends of the 7 cities of gold. He found no golden empires, only pueblos, stone villages shimmering in the desert heat. But he also found resistance. The Pueblo peoples did not welcome the Spanish saviors or rulers. They saw them as violent, unpredictable outsiders. Coronado's men raided villages, seized food, and beat or enslaved those who defied them. The Spaniards brought not just swords, but disease, domination, and a different understanding of power. They left, but they would return. Over the following decades, rumors of wealth in the north faded, but a new motive emerged. Souls. Spain's imperial ambitions merged with its religious zeal. Missionaries, especially Franciscan friars, began lobbying the crown to colonize the Rio Grande region, not for gold, but for God. The Pueblo peoples, they argued, lived in darkness and needed salvation. In reality, these were societies with rich spiritual traditions, older than Christianity, rooted in astronomy, agriculture, and memory. But to the Spanish, these traditions were idolatry. And Santa Fe, when it came, would be built as a tool of conversion. By the early 1600s, the Spanish presence in the region intensified. Scouting parties mapped the land. Reports were sent to Mexico City, describing fertile valleys and docile native peoples. In 1607, Governor Juan de Oñate's failed experiment at San Gabriel was replaced by a new vision: a permanent capital, a center of colonial authority in the northern frontier. The chosen site was a place already known, already used, a basin near the Tewa village of Oga-Po-Oge, White Shell Water Place. In 1610, it would be renamed La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal city of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi. But to the Tewa, it was still sacred ground, and it always had been. The founding of Santa Fe did not mark the beginning of history in the region. It marked the start of a collision between two worlds with radically different values, beliefs, and understandings of what it meant to belong to the land. The Spanish brought iron, crosses, and royal banners. The Tewa had songs, kivas, and oral memory. One claimed dominion, the other honored relationship. It was not a fair meeting. It was the beginning of a long, often violent negotiation over who would control space, meaning, and the future. And it set the stage for all that followed. By the start of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire had conquered the Aztecs, subdued the Inca, and carved a silver path from the Andes to the Atlantic. From Manila to Madrid, Spain ruled a global empire, vast, wealthy, and God-ordained. And yet, in the barren highlands of what is now northern New Mexico, they chose to build a capital. Why? Not for gold, not for trade, but for order, faith, and frontier control. Santa Fe, remote, isolated, surrounded by indigenous power, was not a city born from profit. It was born from imperial anxiety. After the conquest of Mexico in 1521, Spanish ambitions pushed northward. But unlike central Mexico, the lands above the Rio Grande were harsh, thinly populated, and lacking in obvious riches. The Pueblos had no gold, no temples, no empires to loot. Still, rumors persisted. Stories told by indigenous guides and captured enslaved peoples of great cities to the north, where golden walls gleamed in the sun. The most enduring legend was that of the 7 cities of Cibola, mythical cities said to contain unimaginable wealth. In 1540, fueled by greed and a thirst for glory, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a massive expedition north. He brought over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of Mexican Indian allies, livestock, and religious officials. They marched thousands of miles through what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Kansas. They found pueblos, intricate, well-built, thriving communities, but no gold. Disappointed and enraged, Coronado's men turned violent. They attacked the Tewa Pueblo of Tiguex, burning buildings and killing hundreds. It was one of the bloodiest massacres in early colonial history. And then they left. The legend of Cibola had collapsed. For the next several decades, Spanish attention turned elsewhere, to the silver mines of Zacatecas, to piracy in the Caribbean, to church politics in Europe. But the North was never forgotten. By the late 1500s, a new vision emerged. If the North had no gold, perhaps it had souls. Spain's conquest had always been deeply tied to Catholicism. Kings ruled by divine right, and colonies were expected to serve both crown and cross. In Mexico, conversion had gone hand in hand with conquest. Indigenous temples were replaced by churches, native deities rebranded as saints. Now, the exact blueprint would be applied to the Pueblos. In 1598, a new expedition was launched, this time with a more straightforward mission: colonize, convert, and settle. Its leader was Juan de Oñate, a powerful Basque landowner and the son-in-law of the infamous conquistador Hernán Cortés. Backed by the viceroy of New Spain, Oñate led 500 people northward, soldiers, colonists, missionaries, and servants, into the heart of Pueblo country. They founded San Juan de los Caballeros, near the present-day Tewa village of Okai Owinge. It was the first Spanish capital in New Mexico, but it would not last. Oñate's rule was brutal. He demanded food, labor, and obedience from the Pueblos. When they resisted, especially at the Acoma Pueblo, the punishment was horrifying. In 1599, after an Acoma uprising killed 11 Spaniards, Oñate led a retaliatory siege. His men slaughtered hundreds. Survivors were enslaved. Dozens of men had one foot amputated, a punishment that shocked even the Spanish court. The massacre at Acoma drew condemnation in Mexico City and Madrid. In 1607, Oñate was recalled and later tried for excessive cruelty. Though ultimately acquitted, his career ended in disgrace. But the Spanish remained. In 1607, a new governor arrived, Pedro de Peralta, an educated man with administrative skill and imperial discipline. He was ordered to relocate the capital to a more strategic, more defensible, and more symbolic site. Peralta chose a basin at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, near Tewa territory, where trails from the north, south, east, and west converged. Here, in 1610, he formally founded La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal town of the Holy Faith of Saint Francis of Assisi. Santa Fe. The name was not accidental. It invoked both monarchy and Christianity. The Holy Faith was not just a religious aspiration, it was a mission statement. The new capital would serve as a center of governance, a religious outpost, and a beacon of Spanish order in a vast indigenous land. Santa Fe was designed in the Spanish colonial style. A central plaza, government buildings, a church, and military barracks. From this plaza, edicts would be read. From its altars, baptisms were performed. From its jails, resistance crushed. The city would never become wealthy. But that wasn't the point. Santa Fe represented something else: presence. To Spain, planting a capital, even one far from wealth or trade, was a way to declare sovereignty, to stake a claim in the geopolitics of empire. With English ships probing the Atlantic coast and French traders edging in from the Mississippi Basin, Spain saw New Mexico as its northern shield. And unlike the Aztec or Inca capitals, Santa Fe was not taken as a prize. It was a city built from the ground up, on land the Spanish claimed not by war, but by God's will. Of course, the land was not empty. It had been inhabited for centuries, and those who lived there would not surrender it easily. The founding of Santa Fe marked the formal beginning of Spanish colonization in the American Southwest. But it also marked the beginning of something else: a century of tension, repression, resistance, and eventual rebellion. A city built to project order would soon become the epicenter of unrest. A land claimed in the name of the Holy Faith would see uprisings unlike anything in colonial North America. Santa Fe was not a city of gold. It was a city of persistence, a mission of empire, destined to be tested. The Spanish didn't just conquer with soldiers, they conquered with crosses. From the very beginning, the colonization of New Mexico was never just political, it was spiritual. The Spanish crown claimed its authority not only through the force of arms, but also through divine mandate. To civilize the land, they said, was to Christianize it. And in Santa Fe, the church became the empire's sharpest tool. Within months of its founding in 1610, Santa Fe's first religious structure rose, a modest church dedicated to Saint Francis of Assisi. But its walls stood on land long considered sacred by the Tewa people, whose own spiritual practices had guided them for centuries. This was not coexistence. It was a replacement. Across the Rio Grande Valley, Spanish friars, especially Franciscans, set out to establish missions in every Pueblo village. Each one was to serve as a religious hub, a place to baptize, to instruct, to watch. Wooden crosses replaced kiva ladders. Corn dances were forbidden. Drums were silenced. Conversion was the law. At the center of this campaign were the Franciscan friars, agents of faith and empire. Unlike soldiers, they did not carry swords, but they had power. Each friar was tasked with overseeing multiple Pueblo communities, often controlling food supplies, labor arrangements, and legal matters. The friars believed they were saving souls, bringing the true faith to what they called a pagan land. But they misunderstood what they saw. They called the Pueblo rituals idolatry, the Kachina dances devil worship, the ancestral shrines heathen altars. They did not ask. They erased. Baptisms were mandatory. Children were taken from families to be raised under Christian doctrine. Pueblos were forced to build churches with their own hands, adobe sanctuaries that stood as symbols of submission. The Spanish burned ceremonial masks, smashed sacred objects, and punished those who clung to their traditions. A man caught performing a Tewa rain ceremony might be publicly whipped, jailed, or branded. The Inquisition, though milder here than in Europe, loomed in the background. Heresy was a crime, and the friars controlled its definition. But the suppression of Pueblo religion wasn't just spiritual. It was also economic and cultural control. By forbidding native rituals and forcing Sunday Mass attendance, the Spanish disrupted the seasonal cycles that had governed Pueblo life for generations. The planting calendar, once marked by ceremony and celestial observation, was now framed by the Christian liturgical year. Community leaders, once religious figures, were replaced by Spanish-appointed alcaldes and mission overseers. The friars wanted to build a new identity, one in which the Pueblo peoples would no longer be Pueblo, but Christian Indians, loyal to God, the king, and the crown. Resistance brewed slowly. At first, it was subtle. Pueblo families secretly passed down songs and rituals. Ceremonial dances were moved into remote kivas, far from Spanish eyes. Religious items were hidden in granaries or beneath floorboards. Some villagers pretended to convert, attending Mass by day and honoring their ancestors by night. But the friars suspected. And when suspicion grew, so did repression. One Tewa man, accused of sorcery, was tortured and executed in Santa Fe in 1675. Dozens of others were flogged or imprisoned. The message was clear. Christianity was not optional, and for many, it became unbearable. Not all friars were cruel. Some learned native languages, respected local customs, and even defended Pueblo communities from overreach by soldiers or governors. But the institution they served was unrelenting. It viewed Pueblo autonomy as a threat and Pueblo identity as a problem. In Santa Fe, the palace of the governors and the mission churches worked hand in hand. One dispensed royal justice, the other divine law. Both served the empire. By the 1670s, after nearly 7 decades of forced conversion, Pueblo life had changed, but not in the way the Spanish imagined. Beneath the surface, traditional religion endured. Old gods remained. Ancestral prayers still whispered. Ceremonial cycles are hidden, but not lost. The people were watching, waiting, because behind the adobe walls of faith, rebellion was being born. And soon, the friars would learn that no amount of prayer, no cross or sermon, no church built on sacred earth could silence a people forever. At dawn on August 10th, 1680, the pueblos burned. Flames rose from mission churches. Spanish friars were dragged from their altars. Colonial officials were slaughtered in their sleep. Across the Rio Grande Valley, from Taos in the north to Isleta in the south, Pueblo warriors struck in coordinated revolt. By nightfall, dozens of settlements were in indigenous hands. And in Santa Fe, the Spanish barricaded themselves inside their crumbling capital, surrounded, desperate, and cut off. This was no random rebellion. It was a revolution, the most successful indigenous uprising in the history of North America. The Pueblo peoples, after nearly a century of religious repression, forced labor, and cultural erasure, had risen as one. And they had a leader. His name was Popeye, a Tewa religious leader from Okai-Owingeh, once known to the Spanish as San Juan Pueblo. Popeye had endured the Spanish regime's worst punishments. Imprisoned and flogged by Franciscan friars in 1675, he returned to his people not broken, but resolved. In secret, he began organizing a movement. Popeye traveled from pueblo to pueblo, forging alliances between communities long divided by language, geography, and Spanish manipulation. His message was simple: drive out the invaders, destroy their churches, return to the old ways. This was not just about politics. It was a spiritual war, a fight to reclaim Pueblo religion, land, and sovereignty. To unify dozens of villages across hundreds of miles, Popeye devised a brilliant system. He distributed knotted cords to messengers, each knot symbolizing a day. Every morning, a knot would be untied. When the last knot was gone, the revolt would begin. The plan nearly failed. 2 messengers were captured near Tesuque Pueblo, tortured, and killed. The Spanish knew something was coming, but they didn't know when. Popeye, fearing the plan was compromised, moved the revolt up by 2 days. It was a risk, but it worked. On August 10th, the Pueblos ignited. Every mission in northern New Mexico was attacked. 21 friars were killed, most executed in front of their congregations. Churches were burned to the ground. Spanish settlers, including women and children, were slain or forced to flee. In Santa Fe, over 1,000 survivors took refuge in the palace of the governors and surrounding buildings. Pueblo warriors laid siege, cutting off water and food. For days, the Spanish held out, but surrender loomed. Then, in a desperate night escape, they broke through the siege and fled south along the Camino Real. Popeye and his coalition had done what no other indigenous force had achieved against a European colonial power in the Americas. They had expelled the Spanish entirely. For the first time in 80 years, the Rio Grande Valley was free of European rule. The Spanish had lost every settlement north of El Paso. Over 400 colonists had been killed, and Santa Fe, their imperial capital, stood abandoned, its churches in ashes. Popeye's vision now faced its greatest challenge. What would freedom look like? In the months that followed, the Pueblos began to restore their pre-colonial traditions. Kivas were reopened, band rituals returned, statues of saints were smashed, and their stone altars rededicated to the old spirits. Popeye ordered all remnants of Spanish culture destroyed. Christian names were cast aside. Spanish livestock was slaughtered. Crops once grown under colonial oversight were burned. He ruled as a theocratic leader, but not all agreed with his methods. Unity in resistance did not mean unity in governance. Old divisions resurfaced. Some pueblos wanted to reintegrate useful aspects of Spanish life: metal tools, horses, and crops. Others insisted on full rejection. Trade slowed. Inter-pueblo cooperation frayed. And all the while, in the south, the Spanish regrouped. They waited and watched. For 12 years, New Mexico remained free of Spanish rule, a rare and remarkable achievement in the age of European conquest. But it would not last. In 1692, a new governor, Diego de Vargas, returned, leading a Reconquest force. But the revolt had changed everything. When de Vargas arrived, he did not bring the same violence that had defined the early colonizers. Instead, he came with promises of pardon, tolerance, and peace. Some pueblos surrendered without bloodshed. Others resisted fiercely. By 1696, Spanish control was re-established, but it was not absolute. The Pueblo Revolt had redrawn the boundaries of power. The Spanish would never again wield unchallenged dominance in the region. From that point on, their rule in Santa Fe would rest on negotiation, compromise, and uneasy coexistence. The 1680 revolt remains the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonization in North American history. It was not just an act of defiance, it was a statement of sovereignty, of memory, of identity. And Santa Fe, once the seat of Spanish power, became a symbol of both oppression and liberation. A place burned, abandoned, and reclaimed. The Year of Fire did not end the story. It rewrote it. 12 years. That's how long the Spanish were gone from northern New Mexico. For over a decade, the Pueblo peoples lived without friars, soldiers, governors, or taxes. Their sacred dances returned. Their kivas reopened. The old gods spoke again. But by 1692, the empire had come knocking once more. This time, the man at the gates of Santa Fe was not a conquistador like Juan de Oñate. He did not come with fire and sword. He came with something far more powerful: forgiveness. His name was Don Diego de Vargas, and he would brand his campaign not as a conquest, but a reconquest. In the minds of Spanish officials, New Mexico had never truly been lost. The revolt of 1680 was viewed not as a war between sovereign peoples, but as a temporary rebellion, an interruption of rightful rule. The land, they believed, still belonged to the crown. It simply needed to be reclaimed. Diego de Vargas was chosen for the task. Educated, devout, and politically shrewd, de Vargas understood that brute force alone would not restore Spanish power. He needed to persuade, not just conquer. He needed to make the return of Spain seem not like an invasion, but a deliverance. And in 1692, with a small force of soldiers, priests, and civilian families, he re-entered the northern Rio Grande Valley. What he found was sobering. The Pueblos were fractured. The unity forged under Pope had not survived his death. Some villages had embraced the complete restoration of pre-colonial traditions. Others had suffered drought, famine, or internal conflict. The memory of Spanish brutality remained, but so did the memory of Spanish tools, crops, and trade. De Vargas approached with care. He offered a pardon to any pueblo that accepted Spanish rule and Catholic oversight. He brought images of the Virgin Mary, food gifts, and assurances that forced labor would end. He called his campaign the Bloodless Reconquest. At Santa Fe, after a tense negotiation, the Spanish were allowed to re-enter the city. But the peace was thin. The truth is more complicated than the bloodless myth. Yes, de Vargas reoccupied Santa Fe in 1692 without firing a shot. But in the months and years that followed, resistance flared. Several pueblos rejected his terms outright. In 1693, when Spanish settlers returned in large numbers, they faced renewed opposition. A rebellion in Santa Fe itself led to a siege. De Vargas retaliated with executions, hanging over 70 Pueblo men and enslaving many others. The peaceful Reconquest had become a military crackdown. It would take another 4 years of violence, diplomacy, and exhaustion before Spanish control was fully re-established. By 1696, the Reconquest was complete, but Spain's authority would never be the same. The return of Spanish rule in New Mexico came with critical changes. The empire had learned, at least partially, from the revolt. The encomienda system, in which Pueblo communities were forced to provide labor and tribute to Spanish officials, was formally abolished. Missionaries were instructed to be more tolerant. Native dances were still frowned upon, but not always punished. In practice, enforcement varied from region to region. In the old mission churches, burned in the revolt, new crosses were raised. But this time, the friars preached with less fire. And the Pueblo peoples, having tasted freedom, negotiated the terms of return. A new cultural order emerged, one of coexistence under pressure. Some historians call this the beginning of Pueblo Catholicism, a hybrid spiritual practice that blended indigenous cosmology with Christian imagery. In many villages, Kachina dances returned alongside feast days for Catholic saints. Kivas and churches stood side by side. Ceremonial masks were hidden behind crucifixes. It's not a surrender, it was survival through adaptation. The Pueblo peoples had learned too. Rather than outright defiance, they wielded diplomacy, delay, and reinterpretation. Spanish officials now had to rule through a carefully managed balance of force and favor. The empire was still in power, but it no longer ruled without challenge. Santa Fe, once burned and abandoned, was rebuilt. Its central plaza was restored. The palace of the governors reopened as the seat of colonial rule. Spanish families returned, bringing livestock, goods, and children. Trade routes reopened. Life, in many ways, resumed. But nothing was as it had been. The revolt had left scars on both sides. By the early 1700s, Santa Fe had become a different kind of capital. Still Spanish, still Catholic, but now surrounded by a network of autonomous indigenous communities that remembered 1680 and reminded the Spanish that their power was conditional. The friars still preached, but they also listened. The governors still ruled, but they also bargained. The Pueblo peoples still endured, but they no longer obeyed without question. The Reconquest of Santa Fe was not just a return, it was a reckoning. A moment when two civilizations, locked in conflict for nearly a century, found themselves sharing a land neither could fully control. Spain had come back, but it had not triumphed. And in the shadows of the rebuilt churches and restored plazas, the memory of fire still lingered. By the 1700s, Santa Fe stood, rebuilt, subdued, and stable. But if it was a capital, it was a lonely one. Tucked deep in the high desert, weeks from Mexico City and months from Spain, Santa Fe was the northernmost outpost of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. To the viceroys of New Spain, it was distant, poor, and difficult. A province that absorbed more than it produced. And yet, it endured, not by gold or conquest, but by commerce, cultural blending, and sheer adaptation to isolation. Life in colonial Santa Fe was harsh. There were no major rivers to carry goods, no ports to link it to the Atlantic economy. The Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the Royal Road, was the city's lifeline. It stretched over 1,500 miles from Mexico City to the north, winding through deserts, mountains, and hostile terrain. Everything came by mule train: salt, tools, cloth, wine, weapons, paper, even priests. Deliveries were rare, expensive, and vulnerable to ambush. A missed shipment could mean starvation. A delayed caravan could collapse a local economy. The colonists, friars, soldiers, and settlers who remained learned to be self-sufficient. Santa Fe was not a city of riches. It was a city of resilience. Trade with indigenous groups, once discouraged, became essential. The Spanish needed hides, meat, and captives from the Comanche, Apache, and Ute. In return, they offered horses, iron tools, woven cloth, and, increasingly, firearms. This trade was not always peaceful. It balanced on a razor's edge between alliance and raiding. At the heart of this system were the Plains tribes, especially the Comanche, who rose to power in the 18th century by mastering the horse and dominating the buffalo-rich grasslands. Spanish officials in Santa Fe quickly realized they could not conquer the Comanche, so they traded with them. In fact, trade became Santa Fe's unofficial diplomacy. The city emerged as a central node in a web of frontier commerce, stretching from the Pueblos to the plains, from Navajo lands in the west to French traders creeping in from the east. At times, French goods, smuggled through the Mississippi Valley, appeared in Santa Fe markets despite imperial bans. Spanish authorities denounced this as illegal. Local settlers called it survival. Out on the frontier, laws blurred. The Crown's decrees meant little if the nearest judge was 1,000 miles away. What mattered was access to wool, corn, horses, and peace. The settlers of Santa Fe became cultural hybrids, even if they didn't admit it. Mestizo families, born of Spanish and indigenous ancestry, made up a growing portion of the population. Their language was Spanish, but their diets, crafts, and customs bore Pueblo and Apache influence. Children grew up bilingual. Women wore both European mantillas and Pueblo-style moccasins. In kitchens, chili peppers are mixed with maize. In homes, Catholic saints stood beside indigenous effigies. This was not the Spain of Seville or Madrid. It was something entirely different, something uniquely northern, shaped by landscape and necessity. Even the architecture evolved. Santa Fe's buildings blended Spanish colonial design with indigenous adobe construction. Thick earthen walls, flat roofs, wooden vigas, and enclosed courtyards. These homes were warm in winter, cool in summer, and built with local materials. The result was not just functional, but beautiful. A new aesthetic was forming, one we now call Santa Fe style. But in the 1700s, it had no name. It was just how things survived. And yet, the city remained fragile. It had no gold, no silver, no cash crop. Its economy revolved around barter, livestock, and labor. When drought struck, famine followed. When Apache raids intensified, caravans were lost. When governors changed, laws shifted overnight. Still, the people stayed. Not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. The empire, meanwhile, rarely looked north. New Spain's wealth came from central Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. Santa Fe was a footnote, except when it became a buffer zone. French expansion across the Mississippi began to alarm Spanish officials. Rumors spread of trappers, soldiers, and missionaries making contact with indigenous groups on the eastern plains. To Spain, this was more dangerous than any Comanche raid. It was imperial competition. In response, they reinforced their northern garrisons and issued orders for defensive diplomacy. Make peace with tribes, build alliances, trade generously, and hold the line. Santa Fe became not just a frontier town, but a geopolitical pawn. By the late 1700s, life in Santa Fe was a balancing act. Colonists, pueblos, and nomadic tribes coexisted in an uneasy dance of trade, tension, and adaptation. Catholicism was dominant, but not exclusive. Spanish law ruled, but it was not uncontested. Peace was temporary, but repeatedly renewed. In many ways, this chapter of Santa Fe's history was defined not by war, but by negotiated survival. And in the shadows of its adobe walls, a new regional identity was taking root. Part Spanish, part native, entirely New Mexican. Santa Fe may have been a backwater to the empire, but on the frontier, it was everything. A capital not of wealth, but of endurance. A city not of conquest, but of coexistence, at a cost. In August of 1846, American troops marched into Santa Fe. No shots were fired, no blood was spilled, no resistance was made. An entire capital city, with over 2 centuries of Spanish and Mexican history, was taken without a single bullet. But make no mistake, this was an invasion, wrapped in the banners of manifest destiny. The stars and stripes flew where once flew the flag of Spain, then the eagle of Mexico. And just like that, Santa Fe, the oldest capital in North America, became American. To understand how it happened, we must step back. In 1821, Mexico won independence from Spain after a brutal, decade-long war. Santa Fe, along with all of New Mexico, became part of the new Mexican Republic. At first, little changed. Spanish-speaking elites kept their land. Catholicism remained dominant. Pueblo communities maintained their fragile autonomy. But new pressures emerged. Mexico, vast and newly independent, struggled to govern its remote provinces. Santa Fe was still a world away from Mexico City. Roads were poor. Trade was slow. Protection from Apache raids remained unreliable. Into that vacuum stepped a new force, the United States. The U.S. had been eyeing New Mexico for decades. American traders from Missouri began traveling west in the 1820s, creating the now famous Santa Fe Trail. The journey spanned nearly 900 miles, crossing plains, rivers, and hostile lands. But it was profitable. Incredibly so. Santa Fe became a commercial hub, flooded with American goods, cloth, rifles, whiskey, wagons. Mexican officials welcomed the trade. They needed the economic boost, but grew uneasy. More and more Americans were settling in the region. Many spoke no Spanish. Few respected local laws. Some whispered openly about annexation. Whispers would soon become war. In 1846, following the annexation of Texas, tensions between the U.S. and Mexico exploded into open conflict. President James K. Polk, a firm believer in manifest destiny, launched a two-pronged invasion of northern Mexico. One force moved into California. The other, under General Stephen Watts Kearny, was ordered to seize New Mexico and then proceed west to take California. Kearny's Army of the West, nearly 1,700 strong, crossed into New Mexico in midsummer. They expected resistance. It never came. Mexican Governor Manuel Armijo, commander of New Mexico's defenses, was caught unprepared. His militia was outnumbered and poorly armed. Santa Fe's walls were low, its gates symbolic. Armijo debated making a stand, but local elites urged caution. Resistance would mean death. There was no help coming from Mexico City. On August 15, 1846, Armijo abandoned Santa Fe. 2 days later, Kearny's troops entered the city unopposed. The American flag was raised. The courthouse was filled with soldiers. The people watched silently as their capital, for the third time in its history, changed empires. But conquest was only the beginning. Kearny immediately declared martial law and issued the Kearny Code, a civil and criminal legal system for the territory. He promised protection of property, religious freedom, and equal justice under the law. To many Anglo-Americans, it was a benevolent occupation. To many Hispanos and Pueblos, it was another chapter in a long history of foreign rule. The Pueblos were especially wary. Though no strangers to colonial powers, they had learned to navigate Spanish and Mexican systems, securing land rights, religious concessions, and some measure of autonomy. The arrival of American governance threatened all of that. The U.S. did not recognize communal land ownership, which Pueblo society relied upon. English-speaking officials misunderstood or ignored indigenous governance. Protestant missionaries soon followed, eager to civilize the region. The Pueblos feared that their hard-won rights would vanish beneath American courts and land speculators. And they were right to worry. In the aftermath of the conquest, tensions simmered. In 1847, rebellion broke out in Taos, where a coalition of Hispano and Pueblo fighters assassinated U.S. officials and briefly drove the Americans out. The U.S. Army retaliated with brutal force, crushing the revolt and executing its leaders. It was a warning. Resistance would not be tolerated. Santa Fe remained quiet, but the scars of conquest deepened. The city now stood at a crossroads. American soldiers built new forts. English replaced Spanish in the government. New laws restructured the courts. Merchants from the East arrived in droves, drawn by opportunity. Some married into local families. Others looked down on their neighbors as foreign, backward, or Mexican. A new power structure emerged, one that favored Anglo settlers, challenged Hispano landowners, and ignored Pueblo traditions. And through it all, Santa Fe changed, physically, politically, and culturally. The adobe capital of Spain had become a pawn in America's westward march. By the 1850s, Santa Fe was no longer just a provincial town. It was now the capital of the U.S. territory of New Mexico, a prize of manifest destiny and a staging ground for America's continental ambitions. But beneath the American flags and English signage, an older world still pulsed. Tewa prayers in hidden kivas, Spanish hymns in candlelit chapels, stories passed from elder to child, memory to memory. The land remembered. 3 empires had claimed Santa Fe. Each believed they had come to civilize. Each believed they had come to stay. But Santa Fe, the oldest capital of the continent, outlasted them all. When the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad finally reached New Mexico in 1880, something changed forever. For nearly 3 centuries, Santa Fe had remained isolated. It had been a colonial capital, a missionary stronghold, a Mexican provincial seat, an American outpost. But it had always been remote, distant from power, from ports, from progress. Now, with the scream of iron and steam, that isolation was shattered. The railroad did not just bring goods. It brought tourists, merchants, investors, artists, and myth-makers. And it was about to reinvent Santa Fe. The arrival of the railroad in the late 19th century was more than just a logistical milestone. It marked the beginning of a cultural transformation, a reinvention that would shape the city's identity for the next 100 years. But ironically, the railroad never reached the heart of Santa Fe. The terrain was too rugged. The tracks stopped at nearby Lamy, 18 miles southeast. From there, passengers rode wagons or stagecoaches into the city. Even so, the impact was seismic. For the first time, Anglo-Americans could reach Santa Fe in days rather than weeks. They brought with them ideas about the West, ideas shaped by dime novels, paintings, and romantic tales of cowboys and Indians. And what they found didn't match the myth, so they created a new one. By the 1880s, Santa Fe was a dusty adobe town, poor, largely Spanish-speaking, and heavily indigenous. Its buildings were worn. Its infrastructure is minimal. But to Easterners, it had potential. They saw something exotic in the Pueblo-style architecture. In the narrow streets and mountain backdrop, something is picturesque. In the indigenous and Hispanic cultures, something marketable. Enter the era of curated identity. Artists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and entrepreneurs descended on the city, not to change it into Boston or Chicago, but to package its difference. And Santa Fe, facing economic decline and demographic pressure, leaned into the performance. Local leaders began promoting what they called the Santa Fe style, a deliberate revival of adobe architecture with arched doorways, wooden beams, and earth-toned facades. This wasn't just preservation, it was an invention. Many of the city's iconic buildings, including the modern-day Palace of the Governors, were remodeled or rebuilt in the 1910s and 1920s to reflect a romanticized vision of the past. They were designed not to reflect how Santa Fe had been, but how outsiders wanted it to look. The city became a stage set, a place where the Spanish past and the Pueblo mystique were frozen in amber. Tourism surged. Easterners came seeking authenticity. Yet, amid this commodification, something unexpected happened. Santa Fe became a haven for artists and intellectuals. The city's unique light, landscape, and layered history drew painters like Georgia O'Keeffe, archaeologists like Adolphe Bandoulier, and architects like John Gaw Meme. These outsiders were not just exploiters. Many were genuine preservationists and visionaries. They saw Santa Fe not just as a tourist attraction, but as a living archive of American diversity. And they helped fuel a cultural renaissance. Museums were founded. Art colonies were formed. preservation laws were passed. The Santa Fe Indian Market was created in 1922 to celebrate native art on native terms, a move that empowered indigenous artisans and helped preserve traditional forms. But tensions remained. The myth of Santa Fe as a timeless, peaceful crossroads often ignores the real histories of conquest, rebellion, and resistance. The curated Old Santa Fe was not the whole story. It was a selective one that softened the edges, blurred the trauma, and elevated aesthetic over accuracy. And yet, even that partial truth carried power, because it kept Santa Fe alive. As the 19th century drew to a close, Santa Fe stood at a strange crossroads. It was no longer isolated, but it was not entirely modern. It was no longer Spanish, but it was not fully American. It was not a frontier, but not a metropolis. It was something else entirely, a cultural mirror reflecting the dreams, distortions, and complexities of a nation still wrestling with its past. And beneath the layers of adobe and performance, its original soul, indigenous, enduring, and evolving, still burned. Santa Fe had survived conquest, revolt, reconquest, and reinvention. By the dawn of the 20th century, it had been Spanish, Mexican, American, and, for many, romanticized into something timeless and picturesque. But behind the adobe facades and curated festivals, something deeper stirred, a quiet defiance. Because for the people whose ancestors built this land, the Pueblo, the Hispano, the Mestizo communities, the 20th century brought not just tourism and transformation. It brought a battle for memory, land, and identity. As railroads and tourism reshaped Santa Fe's image, the city's original inhabitants began to feel increasingly pushed to the margins, socially, economically, and politically. The Pueblo peoples, despite federal recognition and cultural visibility, faced systemic erasure. Their languages were banned in boarding schools. Their ceremonies are regulated. Their lands were steadily chipped away by ranchers, mining interests, and government reforms. The Hispano community, too, found itself redefined. Once the dominant political and cultural force in New Mexico, Hispanos, descendants of colonial Spanish settlers, saw English-speaking Anglo-Americans seize control of courts, businesses, and schools. Their land grants, protected under Mexican and U.S. treaties, were often dismissed, invalidated, or sold under duress. A centuries-old presence was now labeled quaint, foreign, or other in their own homeland. In schools, children were told not to speak Tewa or Spanish. In courts, elders found their land titles meaningless. At city planning meetings, adobe neighborhoods were razed in the name of progress. And in museums, their cultures were preserved, but their voices were absent. The myth of Santa Fe, beautiful, historic, multicultural, had become a cage of its own making. And from within it, resistance began to rise. In the 1920s and 1930s, Pueblo leaders began pushing back. They demanded recognition of religious freedom, access to sacred lands, and the protection of ancestral sites. Key victories came with the Indian Reorganization Act, 1934, and later in the 1970s, with laws such as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Indian Self-Determination Act. The Pueblo peoples were no longer passive symbols. They were now activists, artists, governors, and educators. Ceremonies returned. Language programs revived. Political alliances strengthened. They reasserted themselves not as relics of the past, but as sovereign nations within a shared but contested land. The Hispano community, too, mobilized. In northern New Mexico, the mid-20th century saw the rise of the land grant movement, in which descendants of Spanish colonists demanded the return of communal lands guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. One of the most dramatic episodes came in 1967, when activist Reyes López Tijerina and a group of armed followers stormed the Rio Arriba County Courthouse in Tierra Amarilla. Their goal: to draw attention to broken treaty promises and centuries of dispossession. They were branded outlaws, but many saw them as folk heroes. Their rebellion echoed the long tradition of defiance rooted in the land itself. Throughout the 20th century, the very communities that had been romanticized and erased reclaimed narrative control. Hispano and Pueblo scholars challenged stereotypes in academia. Artists like Rudolfo Anaya and N. Scott Momaday redefined American literature. Educators and activists built bilingual schools, tribal colleges, and cultural centers. Festivals like the Santa Fe Indian Market evolved from tourist attractions into platforms of cultural assertion, where indigenous artists set the terms, economically, aesthetically, and spiritually. But the struggle wasn't only about history. It was, and still is, about space. As Santa Fe grew in popularity, land prices soared. Wealthy outsiders bought adobe homes, gentrified neighborhoods, and priced out longtime residents. Historic barrios became boutiques. Family-owned land was swallowed by development. The very aesthetic that had once been imposed, the Santa Fe style, was now used to displace the people it once imitated. Culture was commodified. Identity was curated. And behind the brochures, the real Santa Fe was fighting to remain whole. Still, amid this tension, something powerful emerged: a revival. Rooted in authenticity, Pueblo youth began learning ancestral languages with pride. Hispano families documented land histories once dismissed. Artists blended tradition with innovation, creating works that defied romantic expectations. And across Santa Fe, new generations stepped forward, not just as caretakers of culture, but as authors of their future. Santa Fe in the 20th century was not simply a city of preservation. It was a city of reclamation, of land, of language, of truth. Not always united, but never silent. By the century's end, the contradictions remained. Santa Fe was both an art colony and a battleground, museum and home, myth and reality. But it was still here, and so were its people, the ones who had built it, rebuilt it, and refused to vanish. Santa Fe is old, older than Plymouth, older than Boston. Founded in 1610, just 3 years after Jamestown, it remains the oldest capital city in North America. But its real story isn't about age, it's about memory. And the question that haunts every adobe wall and winding alleyway: can a place remember everything it's been and still decide what to become? Today, Santa Fe is a city of paradoxes. It is at once a global arts hub and a sacred landscape, a tourist magnet and a contested homeland, a historic treasure, and a battleground over who gets to own history. Its population is just over 85,000, but its influence, cultural, political, symbolic, stretches far beyond its size. Every year, millions visit its galleries, museums, and markets. They come for the light, the landscapes, the authentic Southwest experience. But for those who live here, Pueblo, Hispano, Anglo, and mixed heritage alike, Santa Fe is not a postcard. It's personal. The city's heartbeat remains the central plaza, where centuries of change are reflected in the architecture and rituals. On any given day, you might see a Pueblo artisan selling handcrafted silver jewelry, a Catholic procession honoring a centuries-old saint, and a contemporary art exhibit challenging colonial narratives, all within the same square block. Santa Fe wears its history on its skin, but not always evenly. Debates over memory and meaning run deep. In 2020, during a nationwide reckoning over monuments, protesters in Santa Fe toppled the obelisk in the plaza, a 150-year-old structure honoring heroes who fought against savage Indians. For decades, indigenous activists had called for its removal, pointing to the racist language and whitewashed history. Others defended it as a symbol of pioneer courage. When it fell, cheers erupted from some. Others stood in stunned silence. The question wasn't just about a monument. It was about who Santa Fe belongs to. Similar questions swirl around Fiestas de Santa Fe, a centuries-old annual celebration originally commemorating the 1692 Spanish Reconquest. For years, the festival featured a pageant where a young woman dressed as La Reina, the Queen, reenacted the peaceful return of Don Diego de Vargas. But for many, especially Pueblo and Hispano critics, the event whitewashed history. Ignoring the bloodshed, the resistance, the complexity, tests grew. Boycotts followed. In recent years, the city has revised the festival, dropping the reenactment and seeking a more inclusive narrative. Still, tensions linger. Because history here is not past tense, it's living. Amid these struggles, Santa Fe remains a cultural powerhouse. It is home to the Institute of American Indian Arts, IAIA, one of the most significant indigenous arts institutions in the world. It hosts the Santa Fe Indian Market, the International Folk Art Market, and dozens of festivals celebrating everything from flamenco to film. Pueblo artists like Roxanne Swentsel, Mateo Romero, and Diego Romero challenge stereotypes through sculpture and paint. Land remains a central issue. As real estate prices soar, driven by out-of-state buyers and luxury tourism, longtime residents, especially from Indigenous and Hispano communities, struggle to stay in their ancestral neighborhoods. Gentrification threatens not only homes, but living culture. The question, once again, can Santa Fe be more than a playground for the wealthy? Can it remain a home for the people who made it? Yet for all its contradictions, something extraordinary persists. In Santa Fe, three worlds, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Anglo-American, coexist, often uneasily, but undeniably. The city is not a melting pot, nor a clean mosaic. It's a woven tapestry, rough in places, with threads tugging in different directions. And like its architecture, mud and timber, old and new, it holds together, not because it forgets, but because it remembers. Santa Fe is not a myth. It is not frozen in the past. It is not the invention of railroad companies or real estate agents. It is a city still becoming itself, built on sacred ground, burned and rebuilt, shaped by conquest, resistance, and resilience. It is a capital, not just of a state, but of a deeper American story, one of survival, negotiation, and the long struggle to tell the truth about who we are. And as long as the wind carries Tewa songs across the plaza, as long as elders teach in Spanish and children dance in regalia, as long as people ask hard questions of old stones, Santa Fe will live.